We're here talking to a man that we'll call Ed, whom I met first in 2001 as a patient. He came to me for a revision rhinoplasty, and as we were talking, he said to me, "I used to have body dysmorphic disorder, but I'm all better now." I'd never heard anything like that. And I've never run into a surgeon who has heard anything like that. So we went through the surgery with the consent of his therapist, and it was very successful. He was happy. Later on, we did another small revision for a different reason. Again, he was an easy patient. He was happy afterwards. The staff liked him. He was one of the nicest, most normal people, if you will, that I had ever met. And afterward, I said to him, surgeons never meet somebody like you who's been through this awful disorder and come out the other side. So if I write you a letter asking a bunch of questions, will you tell me what it was like being inside body dysmorphic disorder? He said, sure. So I sent him off a bunch of questions, and he sent me back a 4-page, single-spaced letter that I found really quite amazing and started me on trying to understand how this problem develops and led to a great deal of research, papers, a textbook, and so on. So I want to go through that letter with him now, augmenting some parts to try to give you a picture of this man's life that I hope will help people with BDD and those who care for them. Your mother and your biological father were divorced.
Yeah.
Did you know your biological father?
A little bit, yep, because the divorce happened when I was around 6, yes.
Did you ever feel that the divorce was somehow your fault?
Yeah, I did. Because I remember my father driving me somewhere, and he said something like, you might not be seeing me for a while. And I kind of knew that I shouldn't repeat it to my mother, what he had said, but I did it anyway because I wanted to be reassured that he wasn't going to leave or something. Mm-hmm. And it led to a fight. And, you know, in my child mind, I thought, you know, that made me responsible, more so than I really was. Probably nothing to do with me, you know.
Describe your mother to me. What was her personality like? The good things, the bad things that you remember?
Well, the good things is that she was very dedicated to us. She really She really wanted to be a good mother, you know. But she couldn't be. She really didn't have it in her, you know. She didn't seem to want to engage us or talk to us or hold us.
If she was not affectionate and seemed to want to be with you, how did that affect you? How did that make you feel?
Well, I wondered what was wrong with me. And, you know, probably more so when I was very, very young, then I realized something was wrong with her.
As you think about your childhood and growing up, in what way do you think you would have been a different person if you'd had parents that were more functional and loving and attentive?
That's like, I would have been a completely different person, I think. I would have been, because, well, the way I view myself now, I feel like I'm a kind person, but I'm not warm. I feel like I have a lot of flaws that my mother had. So when I get too mad at her in my memory, I think, well, now you're very similar to her. So if you're going to get mad at her, you don't want to get mad at yourself, so don't get mad at her. You try not to get mad at her either, because she just passed on the way she was treated to me. And, you know, I'm very similar to her. And I'm glad that I can be kind, you know.
Let's talk for a minute about the adverse childhood experiences study. Remember, I sent you those questions, and you wrote a little paragraph very nicely about each one. For people who don't know, this was a big study done by Kaiser Permanente of 17,000 middle-class, employed, well-insured patients in California. And they asked them about 10 common types of childhood abuse or neglect. Emotional abuse, being called names, being berated by your parents, emotional neglect where nobody seems to care if you're around, physical abuse or being afraid you are going to be hit, physical neglect where you don't have enough to eat or wear or anyone to take care of you physically, sexual abuse, of course, violence against the mother or threats of violence against the mother, alcohol or drug abuse in the family, divorce in the family, mental illness in the family, imprisonment and suicide. I think those were the 10. And as I went through here, you explained a lot of these issues to me in ways that toned down what you went through. I guess I'd put it that way. When I read what you wrote here, you would say, well, no, I never really got hit, but my biological father hit my older brother, that sort of thing.
Well, I was hit.
You were?
Yeah. Did I not say that? When I was being disciplined.
Okay.
By my mother.
So when I tally up the way, based on your essays, the way I would tally up your score out of 10 of these, you had 8 of them. That's a pretty high number. In my own patient study, the average was 2 or 3. I've had patients who had all 10, but not many, but 8 is high. So there was a lot of turmoil in your childhood, and a lot of things happened to you that you may have come to terms with so that you accept them. They don't seem so bad in retrospect, but when you describe what you went through, they really weren't very nice at all. So it was a difficult time. Let's go through the letter that you wrote me, because I think that's fascinating, and I want to bring out a bunch of things here. You said to me, I was an extremely shy, self-conscious, and uncomfortable child and adolescent. I could barely get 2 words out of my mouth in history without becoming tongue-tied and my voice becoming quivery. Talk about that a little bit.
I guess I become more judgmental of myself, in a ways, I guess we'll get to it, that's similar to the criticisms in my head of shyness, very similar to thoughts I would have about my nose later on.
All of these different kinds of childhood abuse and neglect that we've discussed and that you told me about and that were in your note, all of those things have the effect, and you said some of this yourself, of making the child feel defective in some way. My parents got divorced, but it was my fault. They didn't pay too much attention to me, so maybe I wasn't worthy of too much attention. My mother drank, but maybe that was my fault. My brother got hit, bad things happened to my brother, and I feel responsible for that. That's always the way children make sense of their worlds. They don't look at the parents and say they were horrible people, because you're thinking as a child, and so you understand your world in a child's way. But that feeling of defectiveness can follow people all their lives. It's amazing how it starts so young. Now, you talk about your stepfather, who was the first one who really began to criticize your appearance. You said, he spent a lot of time trying to convince me that my nose looked weird. He was a 50-year-old parking lot attendant. He had a large nose as well. Why do you think he selected your nose to talk about?
I think he tried different things.
Yes, you say it took him years. He said, your nose droops, I'm going to call you Droopy Nose, doing his best imitation of a 7-year-old. So this started when you were really very young.
Probably, as soon as my face changed with adolescence, and, it probably started then, and yeah.
I looked in the mirror, turning my head, but everything seemed okay. I was angry that he was trying to upset me. One day he pointed out my brother's nose. "Look," he said, "it looks chopped off at the end." I looked closely at my brother's nose apart from his face. My stepfather was right. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do
whole
remember.
period?
Well, yeah, I mean, I can't remember which brother now. Like I do with my brother Danny, when we said Danny didn't control his anger like me. I was very controlled. And maybe I learned from him growing up that, if you lose control of your anger, you're gonna get hit. My mother's gonna be 10 times angry back at you. So when he just made one comment to Danny about his nose, I don't know if Danny said "fuck you" or like you get an explosion of anger that he never said anything to him again about it. But me, I was trying to what's he trying? I was trying to get into his psychology always. What is he trying to do? What's his motivation? Is he getting pleasure out of this, or is it a game, or I was trying to figure him out. What was going on, and I was trying should I take this at a level of I'll laugh, I'll pretend like it's funny, Maybe it was the first time, or I don't know. I try to laugh off those things,
Let me say something and tell me if I'm right or wrong. It seems like in reaction to the way your stepfather was treating you and Danny, that Danny tended to fight back more, and you sort of stayed below the radar to try to avoid getting into trouble.
Exactly. Yeah, kind of, considering what happened later on, and it ties into the other story. He was my, spokesperson of anger. I should let him be alone like that, because he didn't know whether he was justified or not. If everyone's saying, what are you getting so angry? People can, I guess it's called gaslighting now or something, where they try to deny that they're doing anything wrong. And if you have your whole family doing that and me not saying anything, he might have felt he was more wrong than he really was.
Yeah. In a lot of families, what happens is the parents say things that are very hurtful and shameful, and yet then they say, or someone else says, "But your parents really love you," which is very crazy making, because it doesn't fit. It doesn't feel like love. It feels like torture.
Right.
Then you say here, "The harassment continued. Your nose goes down straight like this," he said, while tracing his finger through the air, "and then it droops. It's getting worse. A family nose. My biological father was mentally ill, so I found this frightening. Finally, the summer before my senior year in high school, I submitted to photographs taken by my stepfather with the express purpose of showing me what was wrong with my nose. He struggled to find the perfect angle, and I let him. So he said to you, 'I'm going to prove to you there's something wrong with your nose.
Yeah,
let
I'm
me
going to take some pictures. Yes.
And let me show you that I'm right.'"
Yes.
He was very persistent.
Yeah. So creative in a way, in a destructive way.
That year, I got dumped by my first girlfriend. I would take out the photographs whenever I felt down. I noticed my nose looked flat at the end. With a pen, I drew in my own tip graph to make my nose look average. One day, I got angry and scribbled through my tip. Generalized self-hatred had transferred to my nose. The battle was over. So I take that to mean that there was generalized self-hatred before that, but now you attached it to a body part. The word that jumps out at me, of course, is self-hatred, because that's a strong criticism of oneself. I'm not a good athlete. I don't have good handwriting. My hair isn't curly. But self-hatred is a very destructive way of thinking about yourself, and it's a generalized. But what you're describing to me as a young man and a child is a very lovable kid. Didn't cause trouble and didn't get into fights. Good to your brother, behaved generally. So what was it that made you feel hate toward yourself?
Well, I knew I was deficient in my own warmth towards people. I felt distant towards people. Sometimes I'd feel like normal and confident. Sometimes I'd turn into this other person, kind of, where I was outside of myself, criticizing myself and judging what I was saying and feeling, far away from her.
In my patients, and in a study I just recently did with physicians, the number one type of childhood abuse or neglect that in that group of 10 I was telling you about was emotional abuse. Criticisms, ridicule, saying things that maybe the person saying thought was funny, but it wasn't funny to the child. So it sounds like you went through a great deal with that. So did Danny.
Yeah, sometimes, when he hit a nerve, it was painful.
And you said, I started looking in the mirror with a second mirror so I could scrutinize my nose and profile. I'd work myself into a state of agitation. I thought that by changing my nose, I would stop thinking about it for even a second and free my mind. I didn't give too much instruction to the doctor. Just don't make me look like a pig. So you made the connection of this feeling of being defective to the nose, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Because your stepfather told you?
The way that I look at it, I had all these I had tons of problems, I was going to have a hard life, to live the life that I wanted to live. Because the most important thing is, connecting with people that you love. So, and I knew it was going to be, and it was my experience up till then. It was very hard, and I was driving people I loved, the girls I had crushes on, away from me because I was so desperate for their love, And the way I look at it now is that I had all these problems and felt bad about myself, and my stepfather created this lens to concentrate, all the bad things were there, and they were coming in, and then he made me focus it on my nose. So then it was like all the things were intensified. It's like a magnifying glass, the light coming through and then focused on that.
That's a very common kind of affliction that leads to body dysmorphic disorder, or a body part, I guess I should say, across all cultures around the world. The nose is the number one most common area where people fixate on and feel as if they can feel better if they get the nose fixed. In the mental health literature, they describe 3 types of shame. Shame, in this sense, meaning feeling worth less or defective, or that something is wrong with me. And the most common one that comes out, the most common type of shame that comes out of a childhood of abuse or neglect is body shame. There's characterological shame, the kind of person I am, behavioral shame, the way I act, and body shame. And body shame is the most common kind. So to me, that's a very interesting link between adverse childhood experiences and developing shame that now connects to the body. And of course, as a teenager, the nose is going to be an easy target. And you say, I didn't like the way I looked after surgery, but I hoped I had broken even. My nose still looked weird, but at least I had actively tried to change something I didn't like about myself. I think that's very good, because you're really trying to take control. I think that's very positive. But your stepfather's reaction is, it still looks weird. And your brother said, it still looks Jewish. So you're right back where you started.
Somewhat, well, later on, because I was determined, I had goals, and I was determined to be a doctor, and that was the most important. I guess that was a way of making up for my deficiencies of lack of warmth. I thought, if I become this important person, and I'll be loved, and my deficiencies won't matter as much. Danny was only a year older, 13 months older than me, but he was 2 years ahead in school, and I looked up to him a lot, and felt very close to him, even though we didn't know how to talk to each other. And that's another bad thing my stepfather did. he stoked the sibling rivalry in sports competitions and so on. That was very bad. Because maybe I could have formed an alliance with Danny against them.
He was playing you and Danny off against each other, telling one was better, one was worse.
Yeah, we were fighting for crumbs.
Now, sadly, your brother committed suicide. How old was he at the time?
21.
And did you see that coming? The doctor said he had no idea.
I did.
You did. He said he'd talked about it, but tell me what you saw that was your clue.
I was very worried about him. And I was very nervous. I was hoping he wouldn't do it. And in some ways we got closer before he died, which I kind of wish didn't happen. I kind of wish I wasn't there. I was it was summertime, and I was home. He was home. He was staying in his room all day, and he dropped out of school. And we were talking about we dropped the act that everything was okay, and that we were having problems, and we had insecurities, and that we weren't perfect, and we weren't confident, and we were quite the opposite. We had never done that.
Yeah.
So I was feeling like somewhat more close to him then, you know?
You had both figured it out.
So I was kind of going through these scenarios, like, oh, so if you start feeling better and you become a lawyer, you still don't think you'll be happy? And he said, no. And I kind of went through some different scenarios, like whether he could imagine happiness himself for the future. And I said, you're not going to kill yourself, are you? He didn't answer. I think he had like a little smile on his face. And I didn't insist on an answer, and within the next morning or the one after that, he was gone. And, I've lived that so many times. And then I try to be the person that I wasn't myself, like, oh, I wish I hugged him then.
What you wrote here is very, very strong. My brother committed suicide. I blame myself for not being more involved in my brother's life. I felt I didn't cry enough. I felt numb. Every day I would wake up and think about my brother. I tried desperately to find some grief and a connection to him. I went to a psychiatrist to feel less like an evil person who had caused his brother to kill himself. I hated myself so much and considered myself an uncaring person. Up above, we've talked about feeling you hated yourself. And here, you're feeling like you're an evil person.
I thought something in me had caused him to do it. I mean, that's when it got very extreme.
Yeah.
It went from like I didn't do enough to like I caused him. I said the wrong thing. I caused him to do that. And there's something evil in me that drove him to it. It was really, really sick.
Does that make sense to you now?
Does it make sense?
You look back on that you were an evil and that you drove him to suicide?
No. I went from that to, I don't know if it's a Catholic thing, like sins of commission, sins of omission, things I should have done that didn't. It isn't that I hurt him, it's that there's many things I could have done that I didn't do.
My life lost meaning. Again, I got obsessed with my nose. I felt sure that it looked operated on and strange. I avoided socializing, which doesn't sound like it was really new. I asked all my friends whether they had noticed anything weird about my nose, and no one had. I remember wanting to drown myself when I went to the beach. So you had very strong, this self-hatred, this feeling you were evil, really made you turn on yourself as well in the same way. I felt my nose looked shapeless, short, and snubby. Then I had another surgery. I remember catching a glimpse of myself after the bandages were removed and noticing a lot of nostril, which is what you had talked about to me and you weren't imagining it. That was the interesting thing for me as I read all this literature is that plastic surgeons see a different group of patients with BDD characteristics than mental health people do. Their criteria start off with the number one criterion is that the thing the person is upset about has to be imaginary or perceived or slight. In other words, something nobody can see but the patient. But originally, you had a bump on your nose. That was a real problem. Many people want surgery for that. Not everybody. When you came to me, the nostril deformity that you had was perfectly real. It wasn't imaginary. So this is where the idea of BDD as it's defined in mental health doesn't always help plastic surgeons, because we see people with real objective imperfections that we operate on, and they get worse instead of better. So in the plastic surgery universe, the person who's obsessed with a feature and perennially unhappy and not helped by surgery, and often depressed, gone through other surgeries but still not happy, that's what the one that drains the staff, calling all the time, taking extra visits, needing extra visits. To the plastic surgeon, that's what plastic surgeons call BDD. But it really wouldn't fit with the real diagnosis in mental health. That's why I think my view is that the body dysmorphic disorders is a spectrum, from people with no deformity to people with very obvious imperfections, crookedness, no breathing, bump, twisted nose from trauma. But what's underlying the desire for surgery is not necessarily the shape of the nose, but the meaning of the deformity to the patient, the meaning of that body part to the patient. And for you, a lot of it was tied up in the way your stepfather had treated you and pointed that out to you and kept hammering you until you gave in. Does that all make sense? Am I making it up right? Or?
Yeah, that makes sense. And kind of, that my stepfather got to me was a defeat. And I guess I kind of imagined surgery because I wasn't, I wanted to bring back the nose that I had in my surgeries. I didn't want to I didn't have some kind of idea I want a thin nose, not keep making it thinner and doing this. I want, if you could have waved a magic wand and said, make it like it was before I had any surgery. And magical thinking or childish thinking, maybe if you could do that, my brother wouldn't have died, and I'd be back, and I would have been a strong person, and I would have stood up to my stepfather, or I would have said, I would have accepted his limitations and been sympathetic. Ideally, I'd want to parent my own, now that I'm old, I'm 61, I'd like to be the parent to my parents in my imagination,
So fixing the nose was the key to starting everything going right again.
Yeah.
I moved back to my parents' house. I felt like a complete failure. I had no car and practically no friends. I felt a sense of guilt. I'd become very sensitive to the fact that there was a huge amount of suffering in the world, and I was doing very little to help alleviate it. My nose obsession grew to its greatest level ever. My nose looked suspended. I tried to pull it down. I pushed my nostrils up. I wrote to my surgeon. By this time, I was looking at my nose for hours at a time, arguing with myself. If it's so obvious to me, why isn't it obvious to everyone else? I would wander around the house looking at my nose in various lighting. I had no money. I begged my brother and my parents for money. I felt totally helpless. What's so unusual about you, for me as a surgeon and the surgeons that I've talked to, is that you've got so much insight to what it was like suffering with this problem. Because many patients have these feelings, but they don't understand ever that they're not all connected to having another operation. So at one point, I asked you if there were stages to developing BDD, and I think this is very interesting. Level 1, nose consciousness in private moments, dissatisfaction, mostly forgotten in public.
So that was before the first surgery, yeah. And, you know, it didn't advance pretty much beyond that on the first surgery. And I just thought, this is an imperfection. I was thinking about it a little bit, and just a little bit I was doing it was bothering me. So why should I ever have this thing that bothers me? You know, I'll get rid of it and then I'll be free, you know. But considering what happened later, you know, that was nothing.
Then you say level 2, on the brink. This is very clever, I think. It's very thought out. Carrying nose consciousness around while in public, fighting it off with varying degrees of success, struggling, wasting time in front of the mirror. This is now the kind of thing that many body dysmorphic patients talk about.
Yeah.
But it still wasn't at its worst point, even then. Because then you say level 3, over the edge, full-blown obsession, spending several hours in front of the mirror, difficulty thinking of anything else. Can you recall what it was like being in that situation and describe it to me?
It's terrible. It's basically totally, I guess it's insanity because you've lost total control over your mind. And at that point, I don't think, you know, talk therapy or whatever. I mean, it might be valuable before the first surgery, if someone said, well, maybe it's not your nose and it's bothering you. Maybe, you know, use this other things and let's talk about it. I think maybe some, you know, that kind of cognitive therapy would have been helpful at that point. But when I had reached that level, you know, when you have no control of your mind, it was so bad.
So this is the point at which you went for the full treatment psychiatric. For the benefit of the audience, the psychiatrist that treated him is extremely knowledgeable about body dysmorphic disorder, has written about it, has researched it, really, in my opinion, one of the premier people in the world to treat this problem. So you got, in theory, the state-of-the-art treatment here. But it looks, I mean, you got a list of drugs. There's 10 different medications here in groups. It looks like she gave you 4 in a group, and then the next month you got 3 different ones, and then 2 weeks later you got 4 different ones, and then a week later you got other ones. So you're getting the Zocor, haloperidol, lithium, benzotropine, Paxil, risperidol, lithium again, Paxil again, Wellbutrin, but in bunches. Were these making any difference?
Well, that was such a confusing time. I don't really, and then when I had ECT, it might have affected my memory also. I do remember some various delusions.
Therapy.
Yeah, electroconvulsive therapy. I do remember, like, one time I was so confused, I couldn't figure out how to put my T-shirt on. I think my mother brought me to the hospital at that time. I did things, I think I got delusional I took a video and I got delusional that I was going to sell it to CNN. And I just went to Washington, D.C., and I think I might even got to the office or something, and then I didn't have the money to get back on the train.
Do you remember what you talked about with any of the therapists? Did anybody talk to you about your childhood?
So from like 93 to 96 is kind of a blur. 97, I guess, when I got out of the hospital, of when the sequence of things happening. Although I can pin down certain things, like, you know, by the medication list helps me to know when that happened. I think it was mainly like, that it wasn't about my childhood or anything like that. It was about encouraging me to get out in group and to notice that no one was staring at my nose, no one was making fun of me. And that was supposed to help me.
Did it make a difference?
No.
Then you say here, various medications were tried. I grew suicidal because I couldn't stop thinking about how deformed my nose looked to me, and I imagined to others. Some medications made me sick, some made me confused. My life was out of control while I looked for a magic pill. I was in and out of hospitals. I remember being so confused. As you said, I spent a whole night trying to figure out how to put on my t-shirt. I went into a 10-day coma from serotonin poisoning. It was the blackest mood of my life, and I stayed in bed sleeping. So at this point, you're living in a halfway house because your mother won't take you back.
I was in a temporary house in like Chelsea or something for a few weeks, I think. And then I was in maybe what's considered halfway house. I think it was in a temporary house.
Group home here, you call it.
Group home, yeah. For a year.
The treatment made me so confused I didn't know who I was. I can believe that, looking at the list of drugs. And then this is the part that is so incredibly interesting to me, and that I think makes you unique from any patient I have ever met who's had this kind of problem, or anyone I've ever heard of. That's why I'm so glad you're willing to talk to me. All of a sudden you say, a lot of the negative energy was removed from my nose. I started to think that my problem was not my nose, but that I was 36 years old and didn't know how to support myself financially, and that I'd never had a girlfriend, and that I would be in this awful situation for the rest of my life unless I worked to change it. I thought my life sucks. I had better do something about helping myself before I can help them. What brought on that epiphany? Did you have advisors? It seems to me you were able to picture a positive future life for yourself. Something good you could work, all this horribleness behind you, you were somehow able to transition instead of thinking, this is my life and it's going to be like this forever. And you were able to imagine a good outcome. How did you do that?
Even though I was confused of who I was, I was putting myself back together, and I knew that yes, there was probably something surgical about my nose, but also I had these, even if I had, if it was made perfect, I knew that wouldn't solve my problems, because I had these other things. Those are the things still there. Those would still be big problems. And I said, because had some will, I said, I'm gonna start, and I felt better. I'm gonna start making my life better. I'm gonna do whatever I can do. I'm gonna make tomorrow better than it was today. And I had goals of, saving the world to make up for my imagined deficiencies in other areas. And I said, well, I can't be guilty about what's happening in the world anymore because I'm really in a bad. That was probably not healthy for me anyway, and it was a positive diversion. It got me activated at that time, the years from 1982 to 1992. It helped me in some ways to political work that I did, and because I couldn't help my brother. I realized I couldn't bring my brother back to life, and that other people are like my brother, and there's suffering people in the world, and they have parts of him, and I'll help them, and that way I'll be able to get out of bed and do things.
This is a thread to me that goes through your whole life, feeling that it's your responsibility to make things right, even if they're much bigger problems than a child even. You were wanted to make things better at home. You felt guilty when things didn't go right with your brother. You felt guilty for what happened to him. You felt guilty for bad things that were going on in the world. So that to me is one extraordinary thing. The other extraordinary thing is that you were able to separate your obsession with your nasal appearance that was so distressing to you from the rest of your life. Because all the patients that I know of that are as severely affected as you were can't do that. They're absolutely positive that it's still a surgical problem. They may have had medication, they may have had other surgeries, doesn't matter. They keep coming back to me or to someone else saying, what I need is another operation. Even when they really become delusional and isolated from their families. I have one unfortunate man I operated on who thought I'd done a small surgery on his nose. He thought all his jaws had moved, his teeth didn't fit right. And I mean, his whole family was distraught. He went all these different specialists getting x-rays, and I said, I didn't touch your jaws. There's no way they can have moved with the little thing I did to your nose. But this is how delusional body dysmorphic disorder can get to some people. But even when your nose felt suspended and you had these thoughts that were delusional, I guess the best word for them, because they weren't true, you still were able to refocus your life. And then you went back to school, you got certified, you became a teacher. And I love this sentence here. I still didn't like my nose, the idea that even getting the first nose job in the first place. But instead of carrying the obsession with myself all day, the last thing I said to myself as I left the mirror was, that's not your real problem. That's what makes you, Ed, such an unusual person. Do you have any other ideas about why you were able to do this? And particularly, I know you don't want to give advice to other people, but there are a lot of patients that I see, there are a lot of people on social media who are still stuck in the bad phase you were, and they don't see a way out. They don't think there's a way out. And a lot of mental health treatment doesn't do much more for them than it did for you. But the treatment, the solution for you was all internal, it seems to me. You did it. Nobody explained to you that your future life could be good. You figured that out, and you were able to imagine a positive trajectory for your life. Can you remember your thought process and how you did that?
Well, I think it was because I had been through it. This is like my third cycle. And so I had learned from the previous two, and I said, God, I can't let it get to level. I don't know if I said that to myself, level 3, in that terminology or anything. I can't let it get to that point again. I have to do things differently. I have to change. So I thought like, oh, this desire to do great things, what is that really about? Instead of saying, oh, I have to do this great thing so someone's going to love me, It's like, that's not a good way of thinking about things. And I don't think I was thinking it then. It's like I have a new mantra, and I'm forgetting what it is because I'm nervous, but it's like, you're fine the way you are. Like, if I'm thinking about the motivation to do something, don't make it be something to get someone to love me because I'm fine the way that I am. And I have to reach that part. And I think anyone who's been abused or neglected, in my case, definitely neglected, has to reach that part of themselves. I had a dream where I was at McDonald's and I couldn't get the attention of the woman there who was supposed to take my order. She couldn't hear me. She was busy. I don't know what it was. And then like an 8-year-old boy came over, or a small boy came over, and took my order and got me my food. And then it seems obvious now, but I didn't think of it. And my psychiatrist said, that was your brother meeting your needs for you. That your mother couldn't meet. So that's why. That's explained a lot, really. And so I always have my brother with me.
The most powerful statement you said just toward the end here was your realization that I'm all right just as I am. That's what everyone should feel, but many people can't, particularly if they've had such destructive experiences as a child and such shameless behavior by caregivers, and that began to feel defective. But you did something that a lot of therapists are not able to do. You did it for yourself, to recognize, I'm all right the way I am.
I haven't done it all by myself.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of help. I had a middle-class family. I had a financially successful brother who paid for things when I needed them. So, I definitely, and I had you as a surgeon, and not only did you do a good job, but you gave meaning to my life and pain that I've experienced. That'll hopefully help people and give meaning to my brother Danny's suffering, that he suffered, and he wasn't able to live longer.
I think your experience and your recognition that you're all right the way you are will help a lot of people who went through what you're going through. And the success that you've had since, and the kind of person that I've always known you to be, who is really wonderful, caring, pleasant, relational, balanced, that is really miraculous recreation of yourself by you. That's what therapists hope to do. By some extraordinary ability of yours, you did it for yourself. And the fact that things aren't always perfect is true for everybody. And it's hard to erase decades of problems and maltreatment in a short time. So things linger. But the most important thing of getting yourself out of this maelstrom of surgical obsession and discovering that you're all right just the way you are is really fantastic, and what makes you such an unusual person. And I thank you for being willing and volunteering to do this documentary. I want people to understand that I get called periodically by media because I taught courses about unhappy patients for years without really understanding what the problem was. So when some popular magazine wanted to write about body dysmorphic disorder, the society would send them to me. And I never did one of those stories because the way the media looks at this problem is kind of humorously, oh, this is the woman who wants to look like a cat. This is the man who wants to look like Elvis. And I kept saying to them, the real story is way more interesting. They didn't want to hear it. And they wouldn't let me see the final written version before it was published. So I always refused to do those interviews. But I always wished there was a way of transmitting this kind of experience to other people who are going through it. And because Ed is who he is, out of the blue, he sent me an email a few months ago and said, I'd like to make a documentary out of my life. And I think that's going to make a big difference. I thank you very profoundly for what you've done.
I really hope so, and thank you.
The story that you just heard of a man with body dysmorphic disorder whose childhood was very turbulent resembles the kind of cause and effect that's been described many times in the mental health literature for other problems, for obesity, for perfectionism, for all kinds of addictions and self-harming behaviors, borderline personality disorder, and so on. So the way I picture this is that you start off with this cauldron of childhood abuse and neglect, which creates a shame core, like the trunk of a tree. And then the branches are all these problems that have been independently connected by various mental health researchers to childhood abuse and neglect, of which I believe body dysmorphic disorder is one. So people come out of their childhoods feeling defective, there's something wrong with me. And they medicate their unhappiness in a variety of ways. It may be drinking, it may be a gambling addiction, eating disorder, perfectionism, borderline personality disorder, are all the outcomes of this terrible childhood, which I believe now body dysmorphic disorder is one. So I think of it as a tree with the core being childhood abuse and neglect, the trunk being the shame that comes from it, the sense of defectiveness, and then the branches being all the problems I just described. And just depends on which one the person chooses to medicate their unhappiness. We see it as each of these problems, but they are in many ways often connected to the same root cause. As we move forward in our research, we should consider that possibility.